Hi everyone! Today I thought I'd give a brief overview on Mesopotamian royal inscriptions because they're one of the most pervasive genres of Mesopotamian written culture that exists in the archaeological record, and they provide us with an awful lot of historical and cultural information. So royal inscription is an extremely broad term and is used to refer to compositions written on behalf of the king, generally speaking that were set up in semi-public areas. They occur through the whole of Mesopotamian history, from the early dynastic period right through to the Achaemenid period, and actually some of the earliest writing we have is considered a royal inscription. These inscriptions are placed on a very wide variety of objects. These include statues, stelae, building materials, and even beads, and primarily contain records of a king's deeds, which can include military conquests, building activity, social reforms, and the creation of dedication objects, or objects for dedication. Famous examples of this include the Stele of Hammurabi. I'm sure pretty much everyone watching this has heard of that. That's a royal inscription. The statues of Gudea, the king that I looked at in my last video, and the Stele of the Vultures, which is another statue that I will go into probably next week sometime. Exactly who these inscriptions were meant to be read by varies quite substantially, and in some cases is really a matter for scholarly debate still. Many of the objects that the inscriptions were placed on were set up in temple complexes and may not have been publicly accessible, and some of them would even have been invisible once they were placed in their intended location. For example, many royal inscriptions are placed on building objects, the so-called building inscriptions. They were inscribed on building materials such as bricks, clay cones, foundation tablets, and even they're called, I call them door hinges. I can't remember what everyone else calls them. They're big stone cylinders that were used as hinges. And the hinges would have been visible once they were installed in a temple, but the bricks and the cones were actually built into the walls and then plastered over, so you would not have seen the inscriptions that were on the objects. The same goes for foundation tablets, which, as the name suggests, were actually buried in a building's foundation as part of the ritual of the temple building. Even if royal inscriptions were visible and publicly accessible, this does raise a question of general literacy levels. Even if you can see something, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be able to read and understand it. So the contents of these inscriptions may or may not have been intended for your average viewer. So even if an inscribed object were, for example, set up in a market square, if you have very low levels of general literacy, the people walking past it may not be able to read what it says. It's really difficult to actually get at Mesopotamian literacy, and there is some evidence to suggest that the general public were more literate than has been previously thought. So it is possible that these were intended to be read by the common people, but they certainly were not the primary audience. Especially in the case of objects like the bricks and the cones that are built into temple walls and just aren't physically viewable. I don't think that's a word. Aren't physically visible when they've been set in place. Because of this, some scholars have even argued that the intended audience for a lot of these inscriptions were the gods instead of the subjects of the king. If you've got something extolling your prowess as king and how amazing you are for building this temple and dedicating this statue, rather than trying to persuade your own subjects that you deserve to be king, it makes a fair amount of sense in Mesopotamia for them to be aimed at the gods who placed you on the throne, trying to prove to them that you are a good king, you are a righteous king, and you should remain king. So I completely forgot to say, and this is why I should start writing more stuff down before I turn on the video. But next week in my daily data, I'm planning on sitting down and actually translating through a building inscription for you. I thought it would be cool to give like a very brief example of how Assyriologists translate the texts we have. And the building inscriptions found on foundation tablets tend to be quite short and relatively easy to get through. So I thought it would be cool to do that. And the reason that I'm doing building inscriptions or royal inscriptions is related purely to my dissertation. Josh did lamentational liturgies in Sumerian, in very difficult Sumerian. I'm looking at royal inscriptions from the early dynastic through to the Old Babylonian period. So it's what I have on my hard drive, it's what I spend my day working on, so I thought it would make sense just to go through one of those quickly. So stay tuned, and I'll see you next week.